Hi everyone, so today I am going to be reviewing for you the 10 most popular books that I've read. So I've done 2 videos similar to this in the past, and the aim of the game is to go into Goodreads, organise my read shelf by a specific category. So in the past I've done lowest average rating and highest average rating, and then taken the 10 books that come up first on those lists and let you know my thoughts and whether they're concurrent with the general populace. But I've always thought it would be really interesting to do the 10 most popular books I've read. So that means the books on Goodreads which I've read that have the highest number of reviews. Nothing to do with their average rating, but just the fact that lots and lots of people have read and reviewed them on Goodreads, so they have been read pretty widely. I think like Goodreads is quite representative in that sense. And see if I, like them or not. Just sort of share with you my thoughts on some books that are obviously incredibly popular and that you might have considered reading yourself. I have set 2 rules for myself before jumping into this list. However, I haven't looked at what will come up, but for one thing, I am absolutely certain that Harry Potter is going to come up, and to be honest, I'm not going to review it in this video because it was in the highest average rated video, so you already know what I think of it from that video, and I also just feel like it's redundant at this point. I am also 100% certain that even if I don't review Harry Potter, there's probably going to be some other series where multiple books come up in them. So, for example, if Lord of the Rings potentially comes up, all 3 books might come up, and therefore I'm just going to review the series as a whole, as opposed to taking up 3 spaces of the 10 with Lord of the Rings books, and then that means I can, talk about 10 different books from different series, if that makes sense. So, to begin, let's go onto Goodreads, organise my read shelf by most popular, and see what comes up. So to absolutely nobody's surprise, the first book is Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, apparently. Of all the books I've read, that's the one that the most other people have read, who are also obviously Goodreads users. But then we actually have 2 books from the Hunger Games. No! Why does this happen sometimes? I literally just have the Hunger Games on here twice, but different editions. And apparently I gave one 4 stars and one 5 stars. That's so interesting. The first time I read it I gave it 4 stars, and the second time I reread it I gave it 5 stars. Regardless, I really like the Hunger Games. I get that it is one of these YA series that, has had its films, it's got all its merch, it's been really hyped up, it's played a large role in popular culture and the development of YA literature over the years, and it doesn't mean there's not been better since. But I really, really enjoyed these books, and I read them after the entire trilogy was already out. I was initially reluctant given the hype, but then caved because some friends that I trusted had read and really enjoyed them and ended up falling in love. I think they're so interesting still, even if they're not perfect, because they're some of the first young adult literature that I read that really delved into topics of PTSD and really exploring how the terrible things that happen to the young protagonist affect her mentally, and that's something that I think was very rare when these books came out, and is still kind of rare. I think characters often get chucked into really dangerous, traumatic situations and the trauma isn't explored, so I always really appreciate that about the series. I think we all know what the Hunger Games is about. I feel like I don't need to explain the plot to you, but I just was always quite a big fan. The love triangle, sure, not my favourite aspect of it, but the characters of Katniss and Peeta, big fan of both of them. And I even liked book 3, which I know some people really felt like went off the wall because it left the sort of constricted environment of the first 2 books, but I thought it was really interesting, and I think it at least attempted to explore the complexities of any sort of political revolution, and I really appreciated that. So overall, I love the Hunger Games series, and I'm kind of going with my second rating here from the time that I reread it. I overall think it's a 5-star series, and I think I've reread it a couple of times and would probably reread it again in the future. Yes, there's a little bit of teenage angst in there that maybe I don't identify so much with now, but I still think it's a really cracker series, big fan. We then have The Fault in Our Stars by John Green, which is fun because this is one of the books that I really sort of associate my beginnings on BookTube with. I remember asking my parents to buy me a copy of this book, pre-order me a copy of this book for Christmas, because John Green ran this whole campaign where all the pre-orders would be signed, and I was like a big watcher of the Vlogbrothers back then. I don't watch them so much now, but I still occasionally check in on a video and still have a lot of respect for both Hank and John Green, and I really wanted to read his new book. I'd never read any of his books before, so this was like my first introduction to his writing. It's not actually my favourite. Like, I like The Fault in Our Stars, but I prefer both Looking for Alaska and Turtles All the Way Down, just for whatever reason. One of the reasons I relate to Looking for Alaska and Turtles All the Way Down more is because I had paralleled experiences with the characters of those books in both circumstances. So maybe I'd feel differently reading The Fault in Our Stars now, but at the same time I just cannot read cancer books now. Like, I just cannot. But I do think it is an excellent book. I enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. It was especially good for me because it was a period in my life where I was not reading. I was in my 2nd year of university. I'd always been an avid reader until sort of like the midway point through high school, but then with life and everything, I really fell out of the habit and lost the joy in something that I'd always really loved. And I started getting back into reading thanks to finding YouTubers who talked about books and deciding to pick up more books myself. I think the Vlogbrothers played a part in that, and one of those was The Fault in Our Stars. I remember the first ever book video I ever filmed for YouTube, which wasn't on this channel, it was on another channel back in like early 2012, was a review of The Fault in Our Stars, a Terry Pratchett book. I think it was Carpe Jugulum, or no, Witches Abroad. It was Witches Abroad, Fault in Our Stars and Handmaid's Tale, which I all read in like the space of a month after not having really read much in years, or if I had read something it had been a reread or listened to an audiobook and I just wasn't so much in the habit, or like university stuff. But basically I'd sort of lost my recreational new books habit, and that really got me back into it. So although I probably will never reread The Fault in Our Stars, it's not one of my favourite books of all time, I'm very grateful to it for that. We then have The Hobbit, and I can already see Harry Potter 7, Harry Potter 7 again, Harry Potter 3, Harry Potter 2, Harry Potter 4, and then Hunger Games 2, Hunger Games 2, Harry Potter. Oh my goodness, are we going to get any other books? Okay, The Fellowship of the Ring, so we're still within Middle-earth. Well, I think that means I should review for you collectively The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, which are obviously incredibly popular books. So I have lots of opinions on this series that some people will agree with and some people will not agree with. I first read The Hobbit as a kid and really enjoyed it. I then reread it again early when I was getting back into reading, sort of in 2012, 2013, and enjoyed rereading it. And I finally read the Lord of the Rings books after my reread of The Hobbit. Again, I think like sort of in 2013, my first year on BookTube or something like that. It might have been 2014, but around that time. And I'd never read the Lord of the Rings trilogy before, but I had seen the films. Big fan of the films, love the films. To be honest, kind of like the films better than the books. And that's not because I dislike the books. I think the books are really like interesting classic pieces of fantasy literature, but for me the films just work a little bit better. I don't know, like just from what I personally want, which I know is blasphemous to some people. Some people far prefer the books, but then I know I'm also not alone in slightly liking the films better. That does not extend to The Hobbit, because the Hobbit films were so upsettingly bad. Except the first one. I really like the first Hobbit film. I think the first Hobbit film, why is this turning into a film review? Regardless, I like the first Hobbit film because I feel like it captures what the essence of the book is for me. And the book is a children's book. I think The Hobbit is so fun and magical and whimsical, and this adventure about this hobbit who's never been on an adventure before, and that's really fun. And there's all these songs, and I love that about The Hobbit. And the first film tried to incorporate some of that fun and that humour. Like, I love the scenes with the trolls. I love the couple of songs that they recorded for the first film. And then the second two films, for me, tried way too hard to turn into like high stakes, epic adventure, adult fantasy, more like Lord of the Rings, with content that didn't really suit that genre, and they tried to draw it out. Like, that one little book did not need 3 films, 2 at the maximum. So that upset me greatly. But I love The Hobbit. Like, I think I like, as a book, The Hobbit better than The Lord of the Rings. But as a whole, I love the franchise. I think the franchise is great. I like all of the books. Don't get me wrong, I just slightly prefer the Lord of the Rings films and slightly prefer the Hobbit book when comparing and contrasting them. Please don't come for me, okay? But I also have high fantasy I prefer, you know, that has more female characters. So yeah, I would still recommend reading all of them if you haven't and you're really into fantasy, because they are classics. We then like have all this Harry Potter and Hunger Games and more Lord of the Rings, and then we have The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which is actually book 2 in the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, this is another classic. In fact, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien were good friends, and The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is one of the Chronicles of Narnia, and it takes place chronologically second in the series, although I think maybe it came out first, I'm not 100% sure, but book 1 chronologically is The Magician's Nephew, and I have read The Magician's Nephew, but I read it after The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which I think is quite common. I think most people start this series with The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and you can completely do that because it follows an independent cast of characters that weren't introduced in The Magician's Nephew. And I used to love this book as a kid. This was one of my childhood favourites. Equally, I was obsessed with the BBC miniseries TV adaptation. Now, this series adaptation actually came out in the 80s, so before I was born. But I obviously caught a rerun of it on TV one day and fell in love. And then whenever I was off school sick, my mum would let me rent the VHS tape from Blockbusters. That was like my routine. If I was ever off school sick, I would rent The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe from Blockbusters. To be honest, we probably would have been cheaper in the long run just having bought me the VHS tape, but that was our system. It's not like I was off school sick every week as a kid, so that was alright. And I loved it. I still love that BBC adaptation. My friend Elle and I were reminiscing over it and decided to have a wine evening where we had wine and Elle cooked dinner and we watched the whole few episodes together one night at the beginning of this year, so that was a lot of fun. And to be honest, it still stands up. It's obviously terrible in terms of like CGI, it's like really like weird special effects. Aslan is basically played by a giant stuffed animal, but I still love it. Nostalgia vibes. And I loved the books as a kid. I don't know if I would love them as much if I reread them as an adult, because I think in lots of ways the values that they contain are quite outdated. They did come out a long time ago. They're very heavy on their gender role divides. For example, the 2 sisters as opposed to the 2 brothers are really very much pushed away from the action and not expected to fight because that's not like womanly, and that I wouldn't be as big a fan of as an adult, but I didn't really notice those things so much as a kid, and I just loved the series through and through. And because I loved The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe so much, I did end up one year for birthday or Christmas being gifted a box set of all the books in the series, and I read The Magician's Nephew. I read The Boy and His Horse, which is book 3, and I hated it, so never continued with the series, but continued to reread book 2. So it's interesting because it still holds a really warm place in my heart. I've still read it many times, but I don't know, like, do I recommend it now? Do I recommend it now because I still think like it has a lot of magic within it. It has lots of really unique, special like world building elements that have influenced later fantasy, but at the same time, like I said, I don't think like the values or the gender roles are very progressive. So if you are going to read it for the first time, I would just bear that in mind. And I don't think there's anything wrong with reading like a classic piece of literature to just sort of like learn what all the fuss is about and the influences, but also, you know, like sort of bear that in mind, like I mentioned. So we then have A Game of Thrones, which is book 1 in the Song of Ice and Fire series by George R.R. Martin. So I've given this book 4 stars on Goodreads, but to be honest, I really just tired of this series as a whole. I only ever read the first 3 books. I read, oh, I can't even remember what they're called, but I've read the first 3 books. I feel like it's the second one's A Clash of Kings and then A Storm of Swords, is that right? Anyway, I've read 3, and it took me years and years to get through those books, despite the fact that I was actively reading them. It took me about a year to read book 1. it took me about 2 years to read book 2, and the only reason I managed to read book 3 a little bit quicker was because I listened to an audiobook, but it still took me months and months and months. And then it was always so interesting because I would feel like I wanted to give it a high rating after I'd finished the books, because they were like reading multiple books. They are multiple perspective high fantasy novels. They're not high fantasy, they're quite low fantasy actually, but they're set in like a medieval-esque world, and they follow multiple perspectives, and I was always so invested in certain characters, whereas I could not care less about others. So whenever I was reading the books, it would take me such a long time to read them because I would just put them down whenever I got to characters I didn't care about and wasn't intrigued by, and then would take ages to get back to it. I loved Daenerys, which probably comes as no surprise to anybody. I loved Arya. Those are the two that I just really remember liking. I can't really remember much else. I don't think the use of like sexual violence is done particularly well in these books. I just don't like the way it's used as a tool. It's like a narrative tool as opposed to really exploring the effect of it on those that are attacked. I thought that was way too prevalent in the series, but then at the same time I do think there are some really clever aspects. There's a lot of really in-depth world building. You can see where he's been inspired by different historical periods. There's elements of the Roman Empire in there which I quite like the parallels of. I think incredible that he created so many distinct personalities and characters and followed all of their storylines as they wove together, but I really just like couldn't care less by the end of book 3. I considered starting book 4, and although I don't think they're bad books, I just didn't care. Like, I wasn't invested. And there are so many fantasy books out there that I prefer and I'm invested in that I would rather spend my time on those. So real mixed bag of feelings towards Game of Thrones. But as we can see, it's a very, very popular series, especially since the TV adaptation came on. It really had like a spike in popularity. I've only seen the first series of the TV show. I don't have any interest of continuing with that either. We then, oh my goodness, I've lost count of how many books I've done. Oh, okay, Lord of the Rings, Hunger Games, Narnia, Game of Thrones. So have I only done 4 books so far? Oh wow, okay. So have I done 5? No, okay, so I think I've done 4. We then have Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, followed by Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. So, oh, Fault in Our Stars, I had done 5. So that's 6 and 7, and we're moving more into like classics now. So Of Mice and Men is more of like a modern American classic. It came out in the 20th century and I actually read it for school. Interestingly enough, however, that did not impede my enjoyment of this novel whatsoever. I love Of Mice and Men. I can completely appreciate why it's a classic. I think it makes complete sense as a book to study, as a piece of literature. It also, you know, like has elements of history in there that it can also like share with students, and I really, really enjoyed studying it. Like really, really enjoyed studying it, and I was probably only like 13 or 14. So this book was like a big winner for me. You probably know what it's about already, but it's one that I think is worth the hype. However, it's the only John Steinbeck I've ever read, even though he's such a highly praised author. I know I loved his writing in Of Mice and Men. My dad constantly recommended other John Steinbeck's books to me because he, I think, owned all of them. Like, there's loads on the shelf there. And I've always meant to pick them up, but I just haven't. So I do plan on doing that one day, but I don't know what's deterred me. However, I've always remembered Of Mice and Men so fondly. I found it such an emotional book. Like, if you've read it, you know how emotional it gets, how like there's some really sad moments. It really deals with like how these two men are struggling in an American society where it's hard to make money and they just want to get by, and they're working as farm hands on different sort of locations, farms, ranches, what have you, and also their bond and their relationship as best friends. And it is rough going, and I just think for me at that age it was also such a sort of revelation for literature. It was probably one of the first classics I read, one of the first adult books I'd read. I'd definitely read some adult books before then, but like one of the early ones that really showed me the like sort of capabilities of classics and adult literature, and I love it for that. And I've always, like I said, just really remembered it very, very fondly. I thought it was so well written, and it is more of a novella actually than a novel. It's quite short but really packs a punch, so that's a popular book that I completely get the hype of, which is the same for Jane Eyre. So Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte is a book I meant to read for a long time. And it took me getting back into reading in my first few years on BookTube when my friend Sana kept telling me how much I would love Jane Eyre. So Sana loves Jane Eyre and she kept raving about it, and I knew I wanted to read more classics. I was probably around like 20 at this point, 21, and I decided to finally give it a shot. And it was a bit of a slow start, I have to say, and I know other people find this with Jane Eyre too. Some people I know have started Jane Eyre and never really got into the meat of the story because the beginning is quite slow. We follow the young woman Jane Eyre, who is an orphan raised by her aunt, but not shown much love, and then sent off to this girls' school. At the very beginning, it's set in the 1800s, and we follow her for a few years at this school, and that's the really slow part for me. I found that I was struggling with that. It took me ages to get through that part of the story. I was sort of waiting for what I felt like Jane's story was to really begin, and I'm glad that I pushed through. At the same time, I get why that part of the story is there. Like, I'm not saying that it necessarily needs to be taken out, but I do think it's one of those books that if you're finding it slow to start with, keep pushing, because trust me, when she gets out of school, it gets so good. And I mean, if you don't like it after then, like, you don't like it, but if you can get past that and to the point where she starts as a governess for Mr. Rochester to his young ward, then you know you've hit the meat of the story, and that's when it gets so good. And obviously, if you look at the book from a modern perspective, Mr. Rochester is not a desirable match. He does some really, like, not okay things in the book, and I would not use him as a role model for what to look for in your significant other. But what I love about Jane Eyre is not even necessarily the romance plotline, it's the story of Jane, because she is such, like, a strong, sure young woman who isn't necessarily always sure of herself and has grown up in quite a loveless environment and is learning to love herself and respect her value and like value her own worth as a human being. And that is what the story is about, that journey of self-reliance and self-discovery. And I love Jane's story. I love Jane's journey. I love every aspect of it, both in her interactions with Mr. Rochester, other characters that she meets later on in the book, and sort of like how she like comes into her own. She is strong in the sense of her like independence and knowledge of herself and the growth that she attains throughout the book, and I think that that is masterfully done. Charlotte Bronte, brilliant writer, fantastic character, so well done. Love this book. We've really reached the opposite end of the spectrum from Jane Eyre because it's New Moon, book 2 in the Twilight series, which apparently, how is that though? Oh, I was going to say, how is that the one that has been the most popular from the series, when there's obviously a first book in the series, which is Twilight, and that's because I've never read Twilight. That's why I forgot about that. I really genuinely forgot that I'd never read Twilight. I watched the first Twilight film when I was about 17 or whatever it was when it came out, and enjoyed it well enough that I wanted to know the rest of the story, but obviously the rest of the films weren't out, so decided to start reading the series from book 2. So to this day I've never read book 1. I've read books 2, 3 and 4, but never book 1. So that's why New Moon is the most popular one that I've read. Now, as you can probably see from that screen grab, I have given New Moon 2 stars. I didn't read these when I was using Goodreads, so I didn't like rate them when I first read them, and obviously I liked New Moon enough to continue on with the series, but when I got Goodreads and was rating books that I'd read previously, I just couldn't give the series more than 2 stars. I read them when I was 17, I enjoyed the film, I was super excited, I consumed them all really quickly. There wasn't a lot of like that kind of like older teen, slightly romantic fiction available when I was that age that I knew of, and obviously that one was very popular, so a lot of people were talking about it, and yeah, I enjoyed it, I consumed it, and I think it perpetuated so many really, really unhealthy relationship dynamics and doesn't counteract any of them. And I have had some unhealthy relationships as an adult, and I'm not saying that that is the fault of Twilight, but I'm kind of sick of media that teaches girls and women from a young age that certain behaviours are okay if a man loves you. Like, I just don't have time for that, and I'm not here for like the renewed hype of Twilight. Like, I completely get if you have like nostalgic love for something. It's like I'm saying that I still have this nostalgic love for Narnia, even though the gender roles are like pretty repressive in it. However, I think it's perfectly possible to like retain that nostalgic love, to be able to acknowledge the things that are perhaps unhealthy depictions within the book. And it's not just the relationship dynamics, is it? There's a lot of problematic stuff about Twilight, and that's true of a lot of older books. Harry Potter has problematic things in it, so I think it's perfectly okay to like have a nostalgic love for a series like that, but I also just think, like, you know, it's time to let it go, and we do not need more books in that series or to continue to romanticize it by promoting new books in the series, if that makes sense. And that's where I land on the whole Twilight debacle. You might disagree, but you know, everyone has an opinion, don't they? So that's mine. We then have The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. That's book 9, right? So then the book after that is Eragon by Christopher Paolini, and that will bring me to 10 books. So let me tell you about my last 2 books. I've already mentioned The Handmaid's Tale in this video, which I think is interesting because, like I mentioned, the first ever video I filmed about books for the internet was a wrap-up review where I talked about the most recent books I'd read, which were Witches Abroad by Terry Pratchett, The Fault in Our Stars by John Green, and The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. All very different. One comical fantasy, one young adult contemporary, and one adult feminist dystopian, which I think is so fun and like really reflective of how my taste has continued to just sort of like be a little bit of everything. And I kind of love that that was the first video I ever made for the internet. I have a funny feeling that actually you can watch that video, because I think when I made this channel I uploaded the sort of 3 or so book videos I previously uploaded on my old channel to this channel, so all my book content was in one place. So if you want to see like a really old awkward video from like 8 to 9 years ago of me reviewing those books, then it is probably one of the first videos on my channel. But I really enjoy The Handmaid's Tale. It wasn't actually the first book by Margaret Atwood I read. I read 3 of Margaret Atwood's books in high school and loved them. She was one of my favourite authors. One I'd read through my own choice, and that was the first one I ever read, which was The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood. My dad gave it to me. It was a retelling of the Odyssey, and I was interested in Greek mythology. I then read 2 for my advanced higher English class, which were Cat's Eye and Alias Grace. Cat's Eye I hated, Alias Grace I loved. So a real mixed bag there, and then, like I said, didn't read so much for a couple of years, and finally read The Handmaid's Tale and really enjoyed it. I think it is a real classic of the sort of dystopian genre that particularly explores sort of sexism, misogyny and patriarchy in terms of not just like future societies but current societies. And I know that Margaret Atwood has said this in interviews, that everything in The Handmaid's Tale is stuff that is happening. It was never a book of things that have yet to happen. It was a book where she took things that were happening across the world in different ways and amalgamated them all together. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. I think a lot of like politically motivated dystopians aren't, you know, what could possibly happen. They are actually a reflection of our society, and we just need to sort of really be able to like look at our own society critically to be able to see that. And I think that The Handmaid's Tale is fantastic. And a really important book in that genre because it does flip backwards and forwards in time. Like, it jumps around a lot in time to before the sort of real state of Gilead that we're living in the main narrative. So you see how quickly societies can unravel and how inequality can spread and develop and new systems can take over. And I don't think anything in The Handmaid's Tale is particularly unrealistic. So the fact that it's such a popular book and a lot of people read it, I think is wonderful and really important. Sure, it's not the only feminist dystopia novel. It's not the be-all and end-all in political dystopian novels, but I think it's like a good example of the genre. Really well written. Like I said, big fan of Margaret Atwood. Have read more of her books since. Think she is a phenomenal writer, even if I don't love all of her books. But yeah, love The Handmaid's Tale. And then lastly, as we saw, for most popular books I've read, is Eragon by Christopher Paolini, which if you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know is one of my all-time favourite books of all time ever. Best books, yes. Great, love it. It is part of the YA fantasy series The Inheritance Cycle, and it's one of the first YA fantasy books I read because it came out when I was like, I don't know, like 11, 12, something like that. It was at that sort of pre-teen age when I first read it and it first came out, and I remember being so excited because the author had been 16 when he wrote it, and I was like an avid writer, always wanted to write fantasy fiction, and I just thought that that was so cool. Like I have this really vivid memory of walking to school. I was on my way to school, first year of secondary school, so around 12, and my granddad pulled over in the street in his car, like honked his car and like pulled over to me and my friend in the street and was like, I just read in the newspaper about this boy who's 16 that published a fantasy series. And I was like, oh my goodness. So I had to go and pick it up, and I fell in love, and I love it to this day. I've reread every single book in the series. Big fan. Think they're fantastic examples of not just the YA fantasy genre. I think they're really complex and would work for adults as well, but obviously as a 12-year-old they also suit me, so all ages. Like they're really complex. They're set in like a really complex fantasy world with so many like political layers that I really appreciate, and also some of the best dragons written of all time. Love Saphira, she is my all-time favourite dragon, and I love the relationship between Eragon, who is the young boy, and Saphira, his dragon, and their bond. That's one of my favourite things to read about in literature. So I think that also influenced my taste. I was already a fan of dragons, don't get me wrong. There were like books I loved as a kid that were about dragons, but like that was really formative in my appreciation of dragon fantasy, I feel. And one of the really cool things is since then I've actually interviewed Christopher Paolini, so he had a new book come out. Goodness, was that only last year? No, I think it was the year before, which was a collection of short stories set in Allegasia, the world of the inheritance cycle, and I interviewed him at one of his like live bookshop events in Manchester, and that was so cool. He's such an interesting person, such an incredible imagination. Obviously a big fandom has arisen around his books that connect lots of people around the world, and as part of that fandom it was a really incredible experience to be able to chat to him about that. So that was really, really cool, and like a real like sort of full circle from that like 12-year-old girl whose granddad stopped her in the street to tell her about this 16-year-old boy that had written a book, to me being 27 or 26 and interviewing the author in Manchester. So nice way to end this video, I think. But those, as you have seen, are the 10 most popular books or series that I have read and what my thoughts are of them. Perhaps if you haven't read any of these books, despite all the hype, despite all the popularity, you will have a better impression of whether you do want to read them now based on my feelings, because you feel we have similar taste or think these things are important to you. So let me know if you have read them, if you have enjoyed them or not enjoyed them, if you would still like to read them, what you've heard about them, and also what is some of the most popular books that you've read and what did you think about them? I would love, love, love to know. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone.